All right, so I was on NPR this morning on the On Point show, and we were talking about how these sort of older athletes continue to excel and really achieve remarkable things. You got Tom Brady at 39 going into his 7th Super Bowl. You had Serena Williams at 35 winning her 23rd Grand Slam. You got Roger Federer, right along those lines. So you start to put it together, well, why are these guys succeeding? How are they managing to pull this off? And unfortunately, to tell you the truth, the segment fell short of expectations. And I think that, they have a sports scientist on, and a lot of the stuff was directed at a Wall Street Journal reporter. And honestly, there were a lot of myths that were perpetuated and some things that didn't get clarified that I think would be really useful, that I think people need to understand. Because when we start looking at these athletes, at their core, they've always been good. It's not like they came out of nowhere. So the question is, how do they sustain this excellence? And I think it's habits. When you really look at it, it's the little things. I think, one of the guests on the show was Dara Torres, who's unbelievable. 12 Olympic medals, won 3 silvers at age 41 in swimming. It's remarkable. And even she said she had some off periods. She took time off. With a lot of the people we're seeing succeed now, even later, these are people that have been going consistently and consecutively. And I think the real challenge is as you get older as an athlete and your window starts to shrink, those day-to-day details matter even more. And can you imagine if you would have done this earlier in your career? But a lot's made of Tom Brady's diet and, avoiding nightshades and the alkaline diet. Is there any science behind this? No, not really. Does it work for him? Something does, but he's also got a personal chef. And there's a lot of things that he can do from a rehabilitation standpoint and prevention standpoint. He's got a phenomenal staff that he has access to. So how do these people keep doing it? I think one of the things that I think was one of the most unfortunate parts of the entire conversation is the reporter actually made a comment how strength training is not really important to these athletes anymore, and it's not about hypertrophy and muscle mass and this and that, and it's more about flexibility. No, flexibility is important, but make no mistake about it, strength training is still critical. It's an issue of how you do it. There's a lot of different ways to strength train, and not all of them mean you have to put on significant muscle mass. But there's no such thing as too strong. And I think when you look at it and how people have longevity, it's building those good habits. And good habits are as hard to break as bad habits. And I think when you look at what you're able to overcome, you just start to realize that as you get older, you do need to influence and impact the recovery process as much as anything else. And I think that the fact that we now have tools in sports science, from heart rate, GPS, sleep trackers, biomarkers, all of these things that we can monitor an athlete more closely and really get a sense for fine-tuning what they're doing. Is it working? Isn't it? It gives us a lot more information. And as a science, we've advanced tremendously in the last 10 years. But keep in mind, when we're talking about these athletes succeeding later in their careers, we're still only talking late 30s. So it's not like it's a relative construct. There's going to be a performance downturn at some point. You can't avoid it. But when we start talking about athletes like, oh, well, Tom Brady only eats this and he avoids all these foods and no sugar and no this. Well, unfortunately, there's sugar in a lot of hydration beverages that has a purpose, for carbohydrate reloading. And so we really don't like to deal in extremes. And even Dara on the show made a comment that she's not nearly as particular as he was. And if you look at her from both a physique and performance standpoint, clearly she's managed to dial some things in. But you're also talking about people that are genetically superior. You want to be an elite athlete, pick your parents well. And I think that was downplayed a little bit too much today on the show, is how important that really is, because genetics even plays a role in recovery. But being able to train smart becomes really, really important as you go farther. And if you started early, it's even better. Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. But smart work beats all of the above. And if you work hard and you work smart and you're talented, you're in really elite air. And that's what we're talking about with these guys. How are they still doing this? Because they're consistent. Because they've managed to avoid major career setbacks. Because if nothing else, even if there's nothing special about their diet, they're paying attention to what they're putting in their bodies. They're paying attention to sleep and recovery. You start doing those things, this is how it all works. And there is a science behind it. Make no mistake about it. But is there anything that qualifies somebody just because they've won X number of Super Bowls, they're suddenly a nutrition expert because it works for them? No. I mean, by that qualification, then we might as well all go out and buy a Papa John's. Right? Because with Peyton Manning, clearly that made a difference for him. It's not an A and a B. It's not a direct line there. So we have to realize there's other things that go into this, and we don't want to get caught up in some of the minutiae that actually aren't true. And I think it's important for what we do as sports scientists to be able to dispel some of these myths. And there's no myth that these guys are succeeding later in life. They are. It's phenomenal. And you know what? The habits they're creating, the things they're doing from a monitoring standpoint, from taking care of their bodies, these are things we can all do. There's a lesson to be learned here. What's probably the most critical thing you could do from a training standpoint to increase longevity? Strength train. And I think it was a real disservice that got downplayed on the show, and we never had an opportunity to discuss that, because I think that sends a really poor message. It's all about how you integrate it. I'm not saying that you just have to lift every day and just move heavy weights every day. There's a process to this, and you need to know what you're targeting. But as we age, we lose muscle mass, we lose strength, we lose power. So you know what? We train for that, and we get to keep it. You know, and so if Tom Brady says, oh, I don't lift weights anymore, I think it's all a question of how are we defining that, because I can promise you he conditions. So is it just that he doesn't do bench press and deadlifts and squats anymore? Or is he doing things that mimic the movements they're using? Hey, and don't forget, when we start to see this massive success, and before we chalk it up to this specific diet or this specific regimen, also realize when you're dealing with athletes who've managed to have the same head coach for their whole career, have had an amazing offensive line, and have avoided injury, there's a lot to be said for that as well. You know, so there's a lot of things that have to come together for these pieces of the puzzle to fit. And I think that it was oversimplified, and make no mistake about it, put everything else aside. Do these diets work? Do these training methods work? The single most important factor in that is if the athlete believes they do, they do. Because they have to feel confident that they're taking care of themselves and they're doing what's necessary. And now imagine if we can apply those same principles and the good science behind what we do, and you get a good coach who has the art of coaching and the science to apply, and you put that together, you have a much longer career span potential because you're starting this earlier in what you do. So like I said, it's not like these people came out of nowhere. They've always been good, and that's why it blows us away that they're able to maintain this consistency and level of performance, and in some cases peak later on. You know, I'll never forget, I think one of the favorite interviews I saw was Ray Lewis late in his career. And they were asking him, you know, how is it that this far into your career, especially with the position you play, that you're playing even near the level you were when you came into the league? And his comment was, I'm better. You know, reporter looks at better. How, you can't be better. He said, yeah, I am, because I finally figured out how to make everybody else around me better. That is what goes into this. So you have to realize that one of the biggest determining factors for these athletes is what's up here. It's what's between the ears. Their competitiveness, their mental resiliency and toughness. And when you put all the other things together and what they're doing, when we talk about an athlete that does A, B, or C for their diet, and they're meticulous in their training, and they make sure they get 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night, and they do this and that, you know what they're doing? They're controlling the controllables. They're doing the things about the things they can impact. They're not worrying about the external things. So when we start to look at that, yeah, you know what? It is entirely possible to succeed later. And if you have somebody who's thinking about getting into endurance sports or triathlons, or they're getting more active again, can all this apply to you? It absolutely can. Because the same lessons we take from them in terms of the importance of nutrition, is it the be-all, end-all? No, but it's a huge part of it. The training and how we apply it specifically to what you need to do. These are the things that you can put into any population and make sure it keeps going. This is how we can peak later. Just remember, the single most important determinant as we go forward, though, is probably the recovery from it. As you get older, it's harder to recover. So what we have to do is pay particular attention to that, and that's where science and technology can come in, and that's where paying attention to your body comes in. You know, you need to have this ability to take action with whatever insights you're given. You know, and I think that being empowered with that allows you to make the right decisions. So yeah, you can train hard and you can train smart. And if you put the talent behind that, now you are seeing that you're able to maintain performance, peak later in life, and still do remarkable things. And maybe that's who we talk about next time on NPR.